It is 11 at night. You have done the whole routine, the bath, the books, the song, the glass of water, the second glass of water, the extra blanket, the check under the bed that they watched you perform with their hands over their mouth. You said goodnight. You turned off the main light. You left the night light on as agreed. You got approximately as far as the kitchen. And then the voice started, small, urgent, with the specific quality that only a frightened child's voice has at that particular hour. There is something in my room. And you go back in. You check the corner, you check under the bed, you open the closet slowly with them watching. You show them the empty space, the familiar shoes, the old toys. Nothing there. You are safe. And they look at you with those enormous eyes and say, "But what if it comes back?" And you have no answer for that. Because to them, the possibility is entirely real. And here is something that every piece of developmental research on this topic agrees on. For the brain they have right now, it is. By the end of this video you will understand exactly why children develop nighttime fears, what is specifically happening inside their brain when the lights go off and the shadows start moving, why the most instinctive parenting responses to this, the rational explanation, the firm reassurance, the telling them there is nothing there, all fail to resolve it, and the 4 evidence-based strategies that actually work by engaging with the brain that created the fear rather than arguing against. This video is not only for parents of children who are afraid of the dark. Every adult who carries a memory of childhood nighttime fear, who still, somewhere in their nervous system, knows exactly what it felt like to be that size in that dark room, will find the complete neurological explanation for their own experience here. The fear was never irrational. The brain that produced it simply had not finished building the system that would have contained it. To understand why nighttime fears develop, you need to understand what the childhood imagination actually is from a neurological standpoint, not as a charming creative quality, but as a specific phase of brain development with real and measurable consequences. Between the ages of approximately 2 and 7, the human brain is in a period of dramatic growth in the regions responsible for imagination, narrative, and mental imagery, the capacity to construct vivid, detailed, emotionally real internal experiences that are not happening in external reality. This is the same developmental capacity that allows children to have rich, sustained imaginative play, to become completely absorbed in stories, to believe with absolute sincerity in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. The same neural machinery that builds these experiences also builds the monster in the corner. The imagination at this age is not a gentle, filtered, well-regulated creative tool. It is raw, vivid, and entirely without the moderating influence of the prefrontal cortex. The same region we established in an earlier video is essentially offline until the mid-20s. Whatever the imagination produces, the brain at this age experiences as real. The second critical factor is darkness, and the role it plays in the developing brain's threat detection system. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, which we know from the tantrum episode, fires faster and harder in children than in adults because it lacks the prefrontal moderating influence, is specifically calibrated to respond to the absence of visual information as a potential threat. This is evolutionary logic. In the ancestral environment, darkness meant that predators could approach unseen, that dangers could not be assessed and responded to, that the safety of the immediate environment was unverifiable. The amygdala's response to darkness as a mild threat signal is present in adult brains too. It is why being in a completely dark, unfamiliar space produces a low-level alertness in most adults. But in a child's brain, where the amygdala is running without meaningful cortical moderation, that signal is not a mild alert. It is an alarm. The darkness does not just remove light. It removes the ability to verify that the imagination's productions are not real. And in that verification gap, anything the imagination has created becomes, neurologically, possible. Where do the specific monsters come from, the specific images, the specific fears that your child can describe in extraordinary detail even though they have never encountered them? The answer is one of the most fascinating findings in developmental psychology, and it changes the way the nighttime fear looks entirely. Researchers studying the content of childhood fears have consistently found that the imagery children produce, the shadowed figure, the thing under the bed, the presence in the corner, is not random. It draws from every source of narrative the child has been exposed to: books, stories, overheard conversations, fragments of media, and crucially, the shared cultural vocabulary of danger that children absorb from their social environment long before they can consciously process it. The imagination at this age is not inventing freely. It is a pattern-matching and narrative-generating engine that is drawing from everything it has encountered, processing the emotional content of those inputs, and producing internally generated imagery that it then cannot distinguish from external reality. Your child is not imagining a generic darkness. They are producing a bespoke fear, built from the specific material their particular brain has gathered. It is, in its terrible way, an act of extraordinary creativity. The fourth factor completes the picture and explains why nighttime fears do not stay in the bedroom, why they begin to seep into daytime, into bedtime routines, into the parent-child relationship around sleep. It is the cortisol loop. When a child wakes at night with a fear response, heart rate elevated, amygdala firing, imagination producing threatening imagery in the dark, the stress hormone cortisol is released as part of the fight-or-flight activation. Cortisol at night is particularly disruptive because it works against melatonin, the hormone that supports sleep, and because its effects on the nervous system are stimulating rather than calming. A frightened child who has produced a cortisol spike is a child who is now neurologically less capable of returning to calm, less capable of rational reassurance, and more sensitized to the threat signals in their environment. Each night this cycle repeats, the nervous system's association between bedtime and threat becomes slightly stronger. The bedtime routine itself, the room, the dark, the closing of the door, begins to carry the cortisol signal. The fear has been learned at a biological level, and rational argument cannot access the level at which it was learned. Here is what this means for you in the real world, at 11 at night in that hallway. It means that when you show your child the empty corner and say there is nothing there, you are communicating with the rational language processing brain, the prefrontal system, about a fear that was generated and is being maintained by the amygdala and the imagination. These systems do not share a language. The rational explanation does not reach the fear because the fear is not being held in the rational brain. It is being held in the threat detection system, which responds not to logic but to safety signals, specific, sensory, experimental signals that the environment is safe and that the trusted person is present and regulated. This is why going in, checking the corner, and saying the right words does not work. It is not what you say that the frightened brain needs. It is what your presence communicates through your regulated nervous system, your calm body, your unhurried actions. You are not there to argue with the monster. You are there to be the evidence that the environment is safe. The first evidence-based strategy is validation without amplification, and the distinction between the two is precise and important. Validation means communicating to your child that what they are experiencing is real and that their experience of it makes complete sense. Amplification means responding to the fear in a way that confirms the external threat as real and serious. The difference in practice: validation sounds like, "I know it feels really scary in the dark." Your brain is making pictures that feel very real, and that is hard. Amplification sounds like, I know, we will check everywhere. Are you sure it is gone? Let me look again." The first response meets the child's nervous system with calm, informed acknowledgement. The second activates the parent's own anxiety, elevates the emotional weight of the bedtime environment, and teaches the child that the fear is significant enough to require repeated checking, which is itself a signal to the amygdala that the threat is credible. Validate the experience. Do not confirm the threat. The second strategy is building a bedtime narrative, a specific, consistent story that your child rehearses about what darkness is and what happens in the night, told in simple and concrete language that matches their developmental stage. Research from the field of narrative therapy with children shows that children who have an accessible, rehearsed story about their fear, not a dismissal of it, but a story that explains and contains it show measurably lower fear responses over time than children whose fear is addressed only in the moment of distress. The narrative does not need to be elaborate. It can be as simple as, when the light goes off, your room is the same room it was in the daytime. The shadows are the same things the light was touching. And I am here, right outside this door, and nothing in this house changes at night. Repeated nightly, at the same point in the routine, in a calm and matter-of-fact voice, this narrative begins to function as a neurological anchor, a predictable, safe story that the brain can access when the imagination starts its work. The third strategy is the coping object, and it works through a mechanism that is more neurologically grounded than it might appear. A coping object is something the child chooses themselves: a soft toy, a special blanket, a small torch, a smooth stone, anything the child designates as their specific protection during the night. Research from child clinical psychology shows that self-chosen coping objects do several things simultaneously. They give the child a sense of agency in their own fear response, the single most powerful factor in reducing anxiety across all age groups. They provide a tactile, sensory anchor that engages the physical nervous system rather than just the cognitive one, which is more effective at reducing amygdala activation. And they transfer some of the safety association from the parent's presence to an object that can remain in the room when the parent leaves. The key is that the child must choose it. A coping object assigned by a parent does not carry the same psychological weight. The child's ownership of the solution is the mechanism through which it works. The fourth strategy is gradual darkness exposure, and it requires patience and a clear understanding of what it is doing neurologically. The brain reduces fear through a process called extinction learning, repeated, safe exposure to the feared stimulus in the absence of any actual harm. The operative word is gradual. Research consistently shows that sudden or forced exposure to a feared stimulus in children escalates rather than reduces fear, because it activates the threat system at maximum intensity without the safety signals required for the nervous system to update its threat assessment. Gradual exposure begins at whatever level of darkness the child can tolerate without significant distress, which may initially be a bright nightlight and a slightly ajar door, and moves, in very small steps over days or weeks, toward a dimmer light and a closed door. Each small step is held for long enough that the nervous system registers no harm at that level before the next step is introduced. You are not teaching your child to be brave by making them endure the dark. You are teaching their nervous system, one safe night at a time, that the dark contains nothing the daytime did not. Before we close, 2 responses to nighttime fears that are completely understandable and consistently make the situation worse. The first is the extended and elaborate checking ritual, going through the room in increasing detail, looking in more places, using a special spray, doing a monster check that gets more thorough every night. Research is clear on this. Rituals designed to remove the feared object reinforce the belief that the feared object is real and present and requires neutralizing. Every checking ritual tells the nervous system, the threat is credible enough that we need to verify its absence every night. The ritual provides temporary relief but raises the baseline fear level over time, because it requires the child to hold the belief that the monster exists in order for the checking to make sense. The checking is not reassuring the fear. It is feeding it. Validate the experience, but do not search for what is not there. The search confirms the possibility of the find. The second response is dismissal, that there is no such thing as monsters. You are being silly, you are too old for this, just go to sleep. Beyond the fact that dismissal communicates to the child that their very real emotional experience is not valid, the research from attachment theory is consistent. A child who cannot bring their fear to their caregiver and receive an attuned response does not stop being afraid. They stop bringing the fear to the caregiver. The fear does not resolve. It finds another expression: school refusal, separation anxiety, physical complaints at bedtime, behavioral changes that seem unconnected to the original fear. The fear needs to go somewhere. If the caregiver closes that channel, the fear finds a different one. What the research supports instead is the calm, warm, brief acknowledgement: your feelings are real, I understand, I am here, You are safe, followed by the consistent gentle return to independent sleep. Not abandonment. Not extended presence. The regulated, loving return to the boundary, every single night, until the nervous system learns it. Before we go, I want to speak directly to the parent who is standing in the dark hallway right now wondering how long this is going to last, who has not slept through the night since the fears started, who has tried everything and is beginning to worry that something is wrong with their child. Nothing is wrong with your child. They have an extraordinary imagination and a nervous system that is doing precisely what an underdeveloped nervous system does with extraordinary imagination in the dark. The research on childhood nighttime fears is consistent on one point above all others: parental response quality matters more than any technique. A parent who shows up calm, regulated, unhurried, validating, builds safety in the child's nervous system regardless of what specific words they use or what specific strategy they are implementing. You showing up is the strategy. The techniques refine it. But your presence, your calm, your capacity to hold the fear without catching it, that is what the frightened brain at the end of the hallway needs most. You are enough. You have always been enough. Little minds, brave parents. See you next time.